The Second World War had ended in 1945, but peace did not follow. Instead, a new conflict began, one without open battlefields at first. But with tensions so sharp, the world lived on the edge of destruction. This was the Cold War, a struggle. Between the United States and the Soviet Union, it was not only a competition of armies or weapons, but of ideas, politics, technology, and global influence. The two nations had fought as allies against Nazi Germany, yet within weeks of victory, distrust consumed them. The Americans feared the spread of communism across the globe, while the Soviets feared being encircled by Western powers. Both sides believed the other might one day launch a surprise attack. From these fears came one of the most dangerous times. In human history, hidden decisions, top-secret plans, and classified operations brought the world closer to nuclear war than most people will ever know. Today, we'll explore those secrets. The missiles never fired, the codes never used, and the plans never carried out, but which had the power to erase humanity in minutes. Asterisk, it all began with the atomic bomb. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 bombs on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instantly changing warfare forever. The Soviets, watching closely, knew they could not allow America to hold such power alone. By 1949, they had developed their own nuclear weapon, detonating it deep in the Kazakh desert. From that moment on, the world lived under a new reality, mutually assured destruction. If one side launched an attack, the other could respond with equal force, ensuring the destruction of both nations and possibly the entire planet. But behind this balance of terror were secret projects, hidden tests, and classified military strategies. Many of them remain shocking even today. The first secret: America's plan to bomb the Soviet Union before it grew too strong. Declassified documents reveal that in the late 1940s, U.S. military leaders had drawn up plans known as Operation Dropshot to deliver over 300 nuclear bombs onto Soviet cities if war broke out. Targets included Moscow, Leningrad, and other major centers of industry and command. The Soviet Union had their own counterplans, training soldiers to march west into Europe within days of a conflict. Both sides prepared for a war they prayed would never come. Asterisk, as the nuclear race accelerated. Another battle was fought in the shadows: espionage. The Soviets learned about the Manhattan Project not through diplomacy, but through spies. Men like Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist working in the U.S., secretly passed atomic secrets to Moscow. Others, including the Rosenbergs, were later accused of helping the Soviets close the nuclear gap down at the same time. The CIA and MI6 ran operations across Eastern Europe, trying to weaken Soviet influence. Many failed, betrayed by double agents or crushed by Soviet intelligence. The feared KGB, the spy war, was more than gathering secrets, was about manipulation. Both sides spread disinformation, funded political movements, and staged coups to weaken the other. Nations became chess pieces in a dangerous global game. Asterisk, in the 1950s, the Americans gained an advantage with the U-2 spy plane, a high-altitude aircraft that could fly above Soviet air defenses and photograph military bases. For years, the Soviets could not touch it, until 1960, when a missile finally brought down a U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers. This sparked a global crisis. The U.S. denied the mission at first, but the Soviets revealed they had captured Powers alive. President Eisenhower was embarrassed, and a planned peace summit collapsed. Behind closed doors, Soviet generals urged retaliation. For weeks, nuclear forces were placed on high alert. A single misstep, a misunderstood signal, could have unleashed catastrophe. Asterisk, when the Second World War ended in 1945, much of the world celebrated peace. But beneath the surface of victory lay the seeds of another conflict, one that would last nearly half a century. The Cold War was not fought with massed armies clashing on the battlefield, but with ideology, espionage, propaganda, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the ruins of World War II as the two global superpowers. They had fought together against Nazi Germany, but now their wartime alliance quickly unraveled. The Soviet Union sought to expand its influence across Eastern Europe, imposing communist governments in nations like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, the United States championed democracy, capitalism, and an open international market. Winston Churchill famously described this division in his Iron Curtain speech in 1946, warning that Europe was split into two camps, one dominated by Moscow, the other aligned with Washington. The world would soon realize that this was not just a political rivalry. It was an existential standoff, where both sides armed themselves with weapons capable of ending humanity in minutes. And while battles were rare, moments of extreme tension, secret operations, near misses, and hidden crises brought the world terrifyingly close to the brink. This is where our story begins, with the Cold War secrets that could have ended the world. The true terror of the Cold War was not just political speeches or rival alliances. It was the nuclear arms race. In August 1945, the United States had demonstrated its devastating new weapon to the world by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These two blasts not only ended the Second World War, but also announced that humanity had entered a new, more dangerous era. For a few years, America held a monopoly on nuclear power. The Soviet Union, however, was determined to catch up. With the help of an aggressive scientific program and espionage operations that funneled secret information from WHL Soviets, Soviets shocked the world in 1949 by detonating their first atomic bomb. The monopoly was broken suddenly. The world had two nations, both capable of unleashing destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. And it did not stop there. The competition to build bigger and deadlier weapons escalated quickly. In 1952, the United States tested the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Just a year later, the Soviet Union detonated their own hydrogen bomb. Each side raced not just to match, but to outdo the other. Soon, both superpowers had stockpiles of nuclear warheads numbering in the thousands. They built intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs) that could travel across the globe in under half an hour. They stationed submarines loaded with missiles beneath the oceans, hidden and ready to fire at a moment's notice. They built bombers that could circle the skies indefinitely, carrying enough explosives to wipe out entire nations. This was more than a race. It was a spiraling, escalating cycle of fear and preparation. Each side believed the other might strike first, so they prepared to respond instantly. The strategy that emerged was known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was chilling. If either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate with equal or greater force, ensuring both nations and, possibly, the entire planet would be destroyed to prevent war. They built weapons so devastating that using them would mean suicide. And yet, as history would show, there were moments when a single misunderstanding, a false alarm, or a human error could have pushed the world into nuclear Armageddon. The secrets of those near misses would remain hidden for decades. The early years of the Cold War were defined not only by ideological clashes and proxy wars, but also by the shadow of nuclear annihilation. After the United States had unveiled the terrifying power of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world knew that warfare had entered a new and catastrophic era. By 1949, the Soviet Union had successfully tested its own atomic bomb, shattering the brief period of U.S. nuclear monopoly. Suddenly, the balance of power shifted. The two superpowers were now locked in a terrifying standoff. each racing to build more destructive weapons than the other. The 1950s and 1960s became a period of unrelenting nuclear development. The U.S. tested the hydrogen bomb in 1952, capable of unleashing destruction thousands of times greater than the bombs dropped on Japan. The Soviets followed closely behind, detonating their own hydrogen bomb just a year later. With each breakthrough, both sides pushed the boundaries of destruction. Massive intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, were developed to deliver these warheads anywhere in the world within minutes. Nuclear submarines patrolled the oceans, carrying missiles that could devastate cities without warning. Strategic bombers remained on constant alert, ready to take off at a moment's notice. The logic behind this buildup was called mutually assured destruction mad. The idea was simple, yet terrifying. If either side launched a nuclear strike, the other would retaliate with equal or greater force, guaranteeing total annihilation for both. In theory, this logic prevented war. In practice, it meant that the survival of humanity depended on perfect calculations, flawless technology, and leaders never making a mistake. The world lived under a permanent cloud of fear. School children in the United States practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as though thin wood could protect them from a nuclear firestorm. Families built backyard bomb shelters stocked with food and supplies. In the Soviet Union, propaganda taught citizens to prepare for an eventual clash with the capitalist West. One simple error, one miscalculation, or one rogue action could have triggered a nuclear exchange that would end life as we know it. And throughout the Cold War, there were many close calls moments where humanity stood on the brink of destruction, saved only by chance, restraint, or the bravery of individuals. This was the dark reality of the nuclear arms race. The weapons that were meant to protect became the very tools that could end civilization. Asterisk, in October 1962, the Cold War reached its most dangerous point. American reconnaissance flights discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The world froze. Suddenly, the abstract fear of nuclear war became terrifyingly real. For 13 days, United States and the Soviet Union stared each other down. President John F. Kennedy announced a naval quarantine of Cuba, blocking Soviet ships from delivering more weapons. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev refused to back down. Each hour brought the possibility of miscalculation of a nuclear exchange that could kill millions. Inside the White House, Kennedy's advisors debated. Some demanded airstrikes, others urged invasion, but Kennedy hesitated, aware that any direct attack might trigger a Soviet counterstrike. Back-channel diplomacy finally opened the door to resolution. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island and a secret agreement to withdraw. U.S. missiles from Turkey. What the world never knew at the time was how close humanity truly came to destruction. Later evidence revealed that Soviet submarines near Cuba were armed with nuclear torpedoes. And one commander nearly authorized their use. One misstep, one wrong word could have ended civilization. And yet, the missiles were withdrawn. The world breathed again. But the crisis left scars that shaped Cold War policy for decades. Asterisk, while armies faced each other across Europe. The real battles of the Cold War were often fought in the shadows. Espionage became the ultimate weapon. From Washington to Moscow, Berlin to London, spies infiltrated governments, military installations, and scientific research facilities. Every secret mattered. Every piece of stolen information could tip the balance of global power. The CIA and the KGB waged a hidden war recruiting double agents, intercepting communications, and carrying out covert missions. Some of these operations remain classified to this day. Among the most notorious betrayals was the case of Aldrich Ames. a CIA officer who secretly worked for the Soviets. His leaks exposed dozens of American assets in Moscow, many of whom were executed. But espionage wasn't just about betrayal. It was about technology. Spy planes like the American U-2 soared high above enemy territory, snapping photos of missile sites and troop movements. The Soviets countered with their own surveillance and by shooting down aircraft sparking international incidents. Perhaps the most dangerous espionage of all came during the nuclear arms race. Both nations raced to build bigger and deadlier weapons. Spies working inside research labs funneled atomic secrets across borders. Some historians believe this constant theft of information may have paradoxically saved the world. Why? Because both superpowers always knew how close the other was to escalation, keeping them locked in a dangerous but fragile balance. In this shadow war, secrecy was power. And in the Cold War, power meant survival. By the late 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had amassed thousands of nuclear weapons. But beyond stockpiles, each side secretly planned for total annihilation. The U.S. had the single integrated operational plan and intricate blueprint for a full-scale nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. Every city, every military installation, every potential target was accounted for. The goal to eliminate the enemy completely and ensure American survival. The Soviets had their own terrifying strategies. One secret project, known internally as Perimeter, was designed to launch a retaliatory strike automatically if leadership was destroyed in a first strike. In other words, even if the Kremlin was obliterated, the missiles would still fire, guaranteeing mutual destruction. These so-called doomsday machines were never meant to be used. Yet their existence meant the world was always on the edge. One computer glitch, one human error, one miscommunication could trigger the apocalypse. In 1961, a single failed test alarm nearly triggered a nuclear alert in the U.S. Air Force officers. Discovered a malfunctioning sensor that falsely reported a massive Soviet missile launch for several tense minutes. Officials debated retaliation until technicians confirmed it was a false alarm. Similarly, the Soviets faced near catastrophe. In 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, monitoring missile warning systems, ignored signals showing an incoming American attack. His decision to treat the alarms as false prevented a retaliatory strike that could have ended millions of lives in minutes. The terrifying truth: during the Cold War, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than most people ever realized. Behind closed doors, behind secret plans and hidden machines, humanity's survival often depended on courage, luck, and restraint. The Cold War was never fought with open battles between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, it was fought through proxy wars, conflicts where superpowers supported opposing sides in distant nations, often with devastating consequences. In Korea, American and South Korean forces clashed with the North, backed by Chinese troops and Soviet advisors. The Korean War left millions dead, yet the world avoided a direct U.S.-Soviet confrontation. Vietnam became another deadly chessboard. The U.S. poured troops and resources into stopping communist expansion, while the Soviets and Chinese supplied weapons, training, and money to the North Vietnamese. Entire generations of Vietnamese, American, and other soldiers suffered in a war that symbolized the global struggle between ideologies. Africa and Latin America were also theaters of tension. Cuba's revolution brought Fidel Castro to power, sparking fears in Washington of communist influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and covert CIA operations highlighted the dangerous dance of intervention and retaliation. Every local conflict had global implications. Small insurgency in one nation could escalate into a confrontation between nuclear-armed superpowers. And behind every battle, spies, intelligence agencies, and secret communications ensured that each side carefully measured every move. While these wars were fought far from U.S. and Soviet soil, the stakes could not have been higher. One misstep could transform a regional war into global annihilation. Yet, paradoxically, these proxy wars may have also prevented a direct clash between the superpowers, keeping the Cold War cold. October 1962. The world held its breath. A Soviet shipment of nuclear missiles had been secretly installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of the United States. For 13 terrifying days, humanity teetered on the edge of nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible choice: invade Cuba and risk direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, or attempt a blockade and hope diplomacy would work. Inside the White House, heated debates raged. Military leaders urged immediate action, while advisors warned that any misstep could trigger World War III. On the other side, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev refused to back down. The missiles in Cuba were both a strategic move and a symbol of defiance. Meant to counter U.S. missile deployments in Turkey and Italy, tense secret communications were exchanged. At one point, U.S. naval forces intercepted Soviet ships heading toward Cuba, raising the risk of an unintended attack. The world watched and waited, most people completely unaware of how close civilization had come to destruction. The crisis ended with a negotiated compromise. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. No bombs were dropped. No cities were obliterated. Yet the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the terrifying reality of the Cold War. One misunderstanding, one wrong calculation, one misinterpreted signal, and the world could vanish in minutes. It was a stark reminder that the Cold War was not just political posturing, it was a constant, deadly balancing act, in a world where nuclear war could erupt in an instant. Information became the most valuable weapon of all. Espionage defined the Cold War almost as much as armies and missiles. Across continents, spies risked their lives to steal secrets, manipulate governments, and influence global outcomes. The CIA and KGB became legendary organizations, conducting covert operations that shaped history. Consider the Cambridge Five, a group of British intelligence officers who secretly passed critical information to the Soviets for decades. Their betrayal revealed the depth of infiltration even in trusted Western institutions. In the United States, figures like Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen compromised intelligence for personal gain, giving the Soviets insight into American spy networks. Each leak, each piece of stolen data, could shift the balance of power and potentially trigger disaster. But espionage was not just about treachery. Double agents, secret communications, and coded messages kept both superpowers in check, preventing misunderstandings that could escalate into nuclear conflict. Every spy mission carried high stakes. A failed operation could lead to public scandal, imprisonment, or death, but a successful one could prevent a war, save millions of lives, or tilt negotiations in favor of one side. In a world of secrecy, trust was rare and paranoia was constant. Every handshake, every diplomatic message could hide a hidden agenda. The Cold War was as much a war of shadows as it was of missiles. While the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink in a deliberate standoff, countless other moments of peril were accidental, almost invisible to the public eye. In 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying 2 nuclear bombs crashed near Goldsboro, North Carolina. One of the bombs came within minutes of detonating an explosion that could have leveled a vast portion of the American Southeast. Only a few fail-safes prevented disaster. In 1980, a computer error at a U.S. missile early warning station mistakenly signaled an incoming Soviet strike. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet officer, refused to report it as real, preventing a retaliatory nuclear strike that could have triggered global annihilation. These incidents were far from isolated. Miscommunications, technical glitches, and human error repeatedly brought the world closer to nuclear war than most could imagine. Every launch code, every radar blip, every faulty report carried the potential to ignite a conflict that no one could stop. Yet, history moved forward, largely by luck, intuition, and the courage of individuals who made split-second decisions under unimaginable pressure. The Cold War was not just a political struggle. It was a constant tightrope walk over the abyss, where the margin between survival and destruction was thinner than most people could comprehend. Asterisk in 1961. The world watched as a physical and ideological divide was carved into the heart of Berlin. The Berlin Wall was more than concrete and barbed wire. It was a symbol of the Cold War itself. East Berlin became a tightly controlled state, patrolled by armed guards and watchtowers. Families were split overnight, lives uprooted, and freedom restricted. The wall was built to stop the mass exodus of citizens from east to west, a movement that threatened the very survival of the East German state in West Berlin. The city became an island of democracy surrounded by a communist sea. Propaganda, espionage, and political tension reached new heights. As both sides tried to assert dominance without triggering a full-scale war, countless escape attempts ended in tragedy. But some succeeded, becoming stories of courage and defiance that inspired generations. The Berlin Wall stood not only as a barrier to movement, but as a stark reminder of how ideology could literally reshape lives, cities, and nations. Its eventual fall in 1989 marked a turning point, a symbol of hope, a collapse of oppression, and the first cracks in the Soviet bloc that would ultimately signal the end of the Cold War. The Cold War was rarely fought with direct clashes between superpowers. Instead, it played out in far-flung regions, where ideology and influence became weapons, and local populations bore the brunt of global tensions. In Korea, 1950 to 1953, a brutal war erupted between the Communist North and the capitalist South, drawing in both American and Chinese forces. Millions of lives were lost in a conflict that ultimately ended in stalemate, with a heavily militarized border that still divides the peninsula today. In Vietnam, the United States poured in troops and resources to prevent the spread of communism. The war became a quagmire of guerrilla warfare, political scandal, and public dissent, leaving scars that lingered long after the final withdrawal. Elsewhere, conflicts in Angola, Afghanistan, and Latin America served as chess pieces in the global game of influence. Cuba became a flashpoint as Soviet support clashed with U.S. opposition, creating crises that could have escalated to nuclear war. Proxy wars were more than battles for territory. They were battles for hearts, minds, and the very vision of the future. Through them, the Cold War shaped geopolitics, leaving legacies of division, instability, and caution that persist to this day. Behind closed doors and in shadowed alleyways. The Cold War was a battlefield of secrets. Spies became the unseen soldiers moving in the gray zones of loyalty, deception, and danger. The CIA and the KGB operated with relentless cunning, gathering intelligence, sabotaging enemies, and orchestrating covert operations around the globe. From Berlin to Havana, Moscow to Washington, espionage dictated strategies that could decide life or death for nations. Double agents, like Aldrich Ames and Kim Philby, revealed that trust could be the deadliest vulnerability. Codebreakers and signal intercepts became weapons, as every message could conceal a plan capable of shifting the balance of power. Technology advanced alongside espionage. Satellites peered over borders, listening posts recorded conversations, and cryptography became an art form of survival. Yet espionage was not only about power, was about fear. The constant shadow of betrayal, secrecy, and uncertainty permeated governments, militaries, and even everyday life, keeping the world on edge and a global catastrophe perpetually possible. Asterisk. October 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, sparked a tense confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. President John F. Kennedy faced impossible decisions: launch an attack and risk global annihilation, or negotiate, while appearing weak. Meanwhile, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev weighed the survival of his regime against the pressure to demonstrate strength. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Naval blockades, secret communications, and backdoor negotiations became the tools of survival. At any moment, miscommunication or rash action could have triggered a nuclear catastrophe that would reshape the planet forever. Ultimately, diplomacy prevailed. The Soviets agreed to remove missiles from Cuba, and the United States secretly promised not to invade the island while withdrawing missiles from Turkey. The crisis demonstrated the terrifying stakes of the Cold War, that mere missteps could have ended life as humanity knew it. It was a stark reminder that behind every headline and political speech, the world teetered on the edge of destruction. And the Cold War was more than a conflict of ideologies, it was a fight for survival. The Cuban Missile Crisis was only one of many moments that revealed the terrifying scale of the nuclear arms race. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to develop more powerful and sophisticated weapons, each determined to maintain the upper hand, from hydrogen bombs capable of obliterating entire cities to intercontinental ballistic missiles that could strike across continents in minutes. Humanity's destructive potential grew exponentially. Military planners devised strategies for mutually assured destruction. The doctrine that no side would risk an attack knowing it would ensure its own annihilation. Nuclear silos and submarines became symbols of power and paranoia. Every test, every new warhead, every intelligence report added tension to an already precarious global balance. The threat was constant and invisible. Ordinary citizens lived under the shadow of potential nuclear annihilation. Schools practiced duck and cover drills, and bunkers were built for survival in a world that might never need them, might need them too soon. The arms race was not just about weapons, it was about ideology, pride, and fear. It showed that the Cold War was not fought only with armies or spies, but with a deadly wager. The fate of the world hanging on the fragile thread of human decision-making. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the relentless tension of the Cold War began to ease slightly, giving rise to a period known as détente. Both superpowers recognized the unsustainable cost of confrontation economically, politically, and morally. Treaties like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Saltai and the Helsinki Accords sought to reduce nuclear arsenals and create frameworks for cooperation. Leaders like Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev engaged in diplomacy that, while cautious, offered a glimmer of hope for a more stable world. Yet, détente was fragile. Underlying mistrust never fully disappeared, and crises such as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan reminded the world that the Cold War could flare back into violence at any moment. This period demonstrated that even amidst rivalry and fear, diplomacy and dialogue could prevent disaster. The Cold War was not just about threats, it was about choices, negotiations, and the constant effort to maintain a precarious peace in a world armed to the teeth. Asterisk. While nuclear standoffs captured headlines, much of the Cold War was fought in shadows through proxy wars across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct conflict, but fueled regional battles to expand influence and test each other's resolve. Vietnam became the most infamous theater. where American troops faced a determined communist insurgency supported by the Soviets and Chinese. In Afghanistan, Soviet forces attempted to prop up a failing regime against local mujahideen fighters, with the U.S. supplying aid and training. Elsewhere, coups, revolutions, and civil wars were often influenced or financed by one superpower or the other, leaving local populations caught in a global chess game. These proxy conflicts were deadly, draining, and politically complex. They allowed the superpowers to avoid direct nuclear confrontation while still asserting dominance. But the human cost was staggering. The Cold War was thus fought on multiple fronts: military, ideological, and cultural, revealing that the war's true battlefield extended far beyond the corridors of power in Washington and Moscow. Asterisk. Behind the public posturing of presidents and generals, an invisible war raged in the shadows and intelligence operations that shaped the Cold War in ways few could see. Spies infiltrated governments, industrial complexes, and military installations. Double agents, defectors, and covert operatives exchanged secrets that could shift the balance of power overnight. Agencies like the CIA and KGB became synonymous with stealth, deception, and high-stakes gambits. Iconic cases, such as the U-2 spy plane incident and the capture of Soviet spies in the West, heightened tensions and fueled paranoia. Every intercepted message, every coded transmission, every clandestine meeting had the potential to spark crises. Espionage was a constant reminder that the Cold War was not only about armies and weapons, but about information: who had it, who could manipulate it, and who could act on it first. In a world where mistrust was a survival tool, intelligence operations were as vital and dangerous as the nuclear arsenal itself. Asterisk. October 1962 marked the moment when the Cold War came closest to turning into global catastrophe: the Cuban Missile Crisis. American reconnaissance flights revealed Soviet nuclear missiles stationed just 90 miles from Florida. The world held its breath as President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev navigated a high-stakes standoff. Naval blockades, secret negotiations, and tense communications defined a 13-day ordeal that could have triggered nuclear annihilation. Ultimately, delicate compromise emerged. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, while the United States secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. The crisis demonstrated the razor-thin line between war and peace and highlighted the necessity of careful diplomacy. Even amid existential threats, the Cuban Missile Crisis became a stark lesson. Humanity's survival depended not just on firepower, but on the wisdom, patience, and restraint of its leaders. It was a moment when the world collectively exhaled, realizing just how close it had come to total destruction. Asterisk. While the Cuban Missile Crisis ended peacefully, it did not slow the expansion of nuclear capabilities. The United States and the Soviet Union continued to develop more powerful, sophisticated weapons, including intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs), submarine-launched missiles, and hydrogen bombs. This arms race created a terrifying reality. Even a limited exchange could trigger global devastation. Other nations began seeking nuclear technology, further complicating global security and raising fears of proliferation. Treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT) sought to curb this expansion. But enforcement and trust proved difficult in a world driven by suspicion. The nuclear arms race was both a deterrent and a source of constant anxiety, shaping foreign policy, military strategy, and public consciousness for decades. Civil defense drills, duck and cover instructions, and fallout shelters became grim reminders that humanity lived under the constant shadow of annihilation. The Cold War was not just a political contest, it was a race to hold the fate of the world in one's hands, a chilling gamble where miscalculation could end civilization. Asterisk. By the late 1960s and 1970s, both superpowers recognized the unsustainable nature of constant confrontation. Détente emerged as a cautious strategy to ease tensions and avoid catastrophic conflict. High-profile agreements, such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-I and II, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, aimed to stabilize the nuclear balance. Diplomatic summits between leaders like Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev symbolized a willingness to engage. Even amid ideological rivalry, détente also extended beyond arms control. Cultural exchanges, trade agreements, and scientific collaboration signaled a tentative opening between East and West. However, détente was fragile, easily disrupted by regional conflicts, political scandals, or renewed mistrust. Yet, these efforts demonstrated that even in the Cold War's darkest chapters, diplomacy could prevent global disaster. It was a reminder that dialogue, compromise, and communication were as crucial to survival as military might. While the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct confrontation, the Cold War spilled over into regions around the globe through proxy wars. Conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and parts of Africa became arenas for superpower influence. Each side supplied weapons, training, and funding to allied governments or revolutionary movements, seeking to expand ideological dominance without triggering a direct nuclear exchange. These proxy wars caused immense human suffering, with millions of civilians and soldiers caught in the crossfire. They also heightened global tensions, as miscalculations or escalations could have reignited full-scale superpower conflict. The Cold War's reach extended far beyond Washington and Moscow. Every battlefield, negotiation, and covert operation carried the invisible weight of nuclear stakes, a constant reminder that local struggles were entwined with global survival. Ultimately, proxy wars illustrated the dangerous complexity of a world dominated by two superpowers. Even indirect actions could ripple across continents and risk catastrophic consequences. The Cold War was not fought only on battlefields or in political chambers. It was waged in shadows, through spies, secret agents, and intelligence networks. Agencies like the CIA and KGB operated globally, conducting covert operations, gathering sensitive information, and attempting to influence foreign governments. Espionage involved sabotage, surveillance, code-breaking, and sometimes assassination, all aimed at tipping the balance of power in favor of one superpower. High-profile cases, such as the U-2 incident, the Cambridge 5 spy ring in the UK, and numerous double agents, revealed the depth of infiltration and deception. These intelligence battles fueled paranoia, mistrust, and political scandals, often straining domestic and international relations. Espionage was a reminder that in the Cold War, knowledge could be as deadly as weapons. Every secret uncovered, every operation executed in silence, carried the potential to shift global dynamics or provoke catastrophe. As the Cold War intensified, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union extended beyond Earth itself. The space race became both a symbol of technological supremacy and a strategic demonstration of power. The Soviet Union shocked the world with Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, and later with Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. The United States responded with ambitious programs, culminating in the Apollo moon landings, proving its scientific and industrial might. While the space race inspired awe and innovation, it was also deeply entwined with military strategy, satellite technology, reconnaissance systems, and potential weapons platforms made space a high-stakes arena for global influence. Beyond politics and power, the space race captured the imagination of the world. It demonstrated that even amid tension and fear, human ingenuity could reach new heights, pushing the boundaries of knowledge and capability. October 1962. brought the world closer to nuclear disaster than ever before. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet missiles capable of striking the United States within minutes were discovered on the island of Cuba. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible choice: risk war to remove the threat, or accept the missiles and compromise U.S. security. For 13 tense days, diplomacy, military readiness, and back-channel negotiations collided. Every decision carried the weight of potential global annihilation, with nuclear weapons poised to end millions of lives in an instant. Ultimately, the crisis was diffused. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and the United States secretly agreed to withdraw missiles from Turkey. It was a narrow escape, a stark reminder of how fragile peace could be when nuclear powers confronted one another. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a turning point, showing both superpowers the terrifying consequences of direct confrontation and underscoring the need for careful diplomacy. The Cold War was defined by the shadow of nuclear weapons. Both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to develop bigger, faster, and more destructive arsenals, each hoping to deter the other from launching a first strike. Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and hydrogen bombs multiplied at alarming rates. The concept of mutually assured destruction emerged, a terrifying balance where any nuclear attack would trigger total annihilation for both sides. Tests and detonations, often in remote locations, demonstrated not only technological prowess, but also humanity's willingness to flirt with annihilation. Civil defense programs, duck and cover drills, and fallout shelters became part of daily life, constant reminder of the stakes. The arms race fueled political tension, strained economies, and terrified populations. Yet it also spurred innovation, from nuclear energy to missile guidance systems. Highlighting the dual-edged nature of human ingenuity, the world lived under the constant shadow of a doomsday that could be unleashed with a single step. While the superpowers avoided direct conflict, they waged war indirectly through smaller nations. These proxy wars became battlegrounds for ideology, resources, and influence. Korea, Vietnam, Angola, and Afghanistan all became theaters where the U.S. and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides. Arms, training, and funds flowed across borders, intensifying local conflicts while avoiding a direct nuclear confrontation. The human cost was staggering. Millions of lives were lost or displaced, and entire regions were destabilized. Yet these wars also showcased the global reach of Cold War politics and the lengths each superpower would go to protect its interests. Proxy wars allowed both nations to test new weapons, strategies, and intelligence operations. They were a deadly chess game, where pawns were human lives and the stakes were the balance of global power. The Cold War was not only fought on battlefields or in boardrooms, it was waged in the shadows. Spies, double agents, and covert operatives became essential tools in the struggle for supremacy. From the CIA's secret missions to the KGB's intricate networks, intelligence operations shaped global events. Infiltration, surveillance, and sabotage were routine. Sometimes, a single leak or intercepted message could tip the balance of power or prevent disaster. Espionage also introduced an air of paranoia. Governments distrusted even their allies, and fear of infiltration influenced policy decisions and military strategies. High-profile cases, such as the capture of U-2 pilot Gary Powers or the defection of Soviet agents, made headlines and revealed the high stakes behind the scenes. The spy world was dangerous, silent, and unforgiving. It reminded the world that, in the Cold War, information was as lethal as any missile. By the late 1980s, decades of tension, propaganda, and confrontation began to show signs of unraveling. Economic stagnation in the Soviet Union and the rise of reformist leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev shifted the global landscape. In 1989, a historic moment captured the world's attention: the fall of the Berlin Wall. For nearly 3 decades, the wall had symbolized division, oppression, and the ideological struggle between East and West. Crowds surged through checkpoints, chipping away at concrete and steel with hammers and hope. Families separated for decades reunited, and the walls of suspicion and fear began to crumble. This event marked not just the physical reunification of a city, but the symbolic beginning of the end. For the Cold War, it was a testament to the resilience of ordinary people and the inefficacy of rigid ideologies in the face of a global desire for freedom. Asterisk, as the world edged ever closer to nuclear annihilation, dialogue became essential. Treaties and negotiations emerged as tools to curb the proliferation of weapons that could end civilization. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks SALT and later agreements like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty (INF) aimed to reduce stockpiles, limit missile deployment, and establish verification protocols. Leaders such as Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev spearheaded efforts to prevent an accidental or intentional nuclear conflict. These talks required extraordinary trust in a climate dominated by suspicion. Yet they underscored a critical truth: despite decades of hostility, diplomacy remained humanity's most vital defense. Each treaty signed, each agreement honored, brought the world one step back from the brink, reminding nations that survival sometimes depended more on negotiation than on firepower. Asterisk, by the early 1990s, the Soviet Union, once a colossus of military might and ideology, began to crumble from within. Economic inefficiency, political unrest, and nationalist movements across its republic strained the fabric of the state. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness sought reform, but also accelerated calls for independence and transparency. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine declared sovereignty, signaling the unraveling of Soviet control. In December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, leaving behind 15 independent nations and a transformed geopolitical landscape. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, but the threat of nuclear conflict remained a haunting legacy. The Cold War had ended. Ambitions endured. Unchecked ambition, secrecy, and ideological rigidity could bring the world perilously close to annihilation. History had witnessed the ultimate gamble, the brinkmanship of civilization itself. Asterisk, the Cold War may have ended, but its impact still echoes across politics, technology, and international relations. Nuclear weapons remain a global threat, and the strategies, espionage techniques, and alliances forged during those decades continue to shape diplomacy. The era taught the world about the dangers of unchecked power, miscommunication, and ideological rigidity. It also showed the importance of diplomacy, negotiation, and international cooperation in averting global catastrophe. From the tense standoffs of Berlin and Cuba to the shadow wars fought in distant lands, the Cold War demonstrated both the fragility and resilience of humanity. Lessons learned from brinkmanship, espionage, and proxy conflicts remain relevant as new powers emerge and old tensions resurface. While the nuclear threat has not disappeared, the legacy of those decades underscores one truth: the world survived. Not by accident, but by cautious, calculated decisions that balanced ambition with restraint. Asterisk, looking back, the Cold War stands as one of history's closest calls. Humanity flirted with annihilation more times than most can imagine, yet survived through a combination of strategy, diplomacy, and sheer luck. Every missile silo, spy mission, and high-stakes negotiation carried the weight of the world's future. The world watched, often unaware, as leaders balanced paranoia with pragmatism and ideology with survival. The era reminds us that the threats of secrecy, miscommunication, and extreme ambition are never far from reality. Even in peace, the echoes of Cold War fears influence military planning, intelligence operations, and international relations today. The story of the Cold War is not just about nations, it is about humanity itself. It is a story of tension and terror, but also of restraint and reason, a testament to the precariousness of our shared existence. Asterisk. Though the Cold War officially ended decades ago, its lessons are more relevant than ever. Rising global powers, regional conflicts, and technological advancements create new arenas for tension reminiscent of the superpower standoff. Cyber warfare, nuclear proliferation, and information manipulation echo the strategies of the past. Diplomacy, negotiation, and international cooperation remain the most effective tools to prevent escalation. Understanding the Cold War teaches nations to balance ambition with caution, power with responsibility. It reminds leaders that miscommunication or overreach can have catastrophic consequences, not just for countries, but for all of humanity. The ghosts of the past guide present policies, and the story of brinkmanship serves as both warning and instruction. To navigate today's challenges wisely, we must remember the narrow escapes of yesterday and the delicate threads that held the world together. Asterisk. The Cold War was not just a historical conflict. It was a test of humanity's ability to survive its own creations. For nearly half a century, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear catastrophe, with countless lives and civilizations hanging in the balance. Yet, through diplomacy, courage, and cautious restraint, humanity endured. The lessons of the Cold War remind us that peace is fragile and vigilance is perpetual. In a world still facing geopolitical tension, emerging technologies, and the ever-present shadow of conflict, the story of the Cold War stands as a guide. It urges leaders and citizens alike to value dialogue over destruction, understanding over ignorance, and foresight over impulsive action. Ultimately, the survival of humanity depended not on weapons, but on wisdom, the recognition that the cost of failure would be too great to bear. Asterisk.